There is a place in the mountains of Colorado where the wind never stops and the sun barely reaches. A place where men live in a box the size of a parking space. 23 hours a day. Every day. With no human contact. For years. Sometimes decades. Sometimes the rest of their lives. It is not a horror story someone made up. It is a real federal prison. And it has a name. ADX Florence. The toughest prison on American soil. And the most chilling part. The men inside did not always arrive there because of one catastrophic life of crime. Some of them arrived because of one moment. One miscalculation. One decision that crossed an invisible line they did not see coming. This is how that happens. According to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, ADX Florence holds roughly 400 inmates at any given time. That is it. 400 men, out of a federal prison population of over 150,000, getting sent there is not routine. It requires a specific chain of events. A sequence of escalation that starts somewhere that most people never expected to end here, but it does end here. And once you arrive, the data is sobering. Bureau of Prisons records and reporting by outlets including the Marshall Project and the New York Times show that many ADX inmates spend upward of a decade in near total isolation. Some have been there for over 20 years. A handful have never left. So how does it happen? How does one mistake set the chain in motion? Stay until the end of this video, because the answer is more unsettling than you think. If this already sounds like something out of a nightmare, you have not heard the full story yet. Subscribe and hit the bell so you do not miss the rest of this. It gets worse before it gets clearer. Before a man ever sees the inside of ADX Florence, the system has already made several decisions about him, and the system uses a very specific process to make those decisions. The Federal Bureau of Prisons uses what is called a classification system. Every inmate in federal custody is assigned a security level: minimum, low, medium, high, and then, beyond all of those, there is a category that is not even officially called a security level in the traditional sense. It is called a special management unit designation or administrative maximum, and it is the end of the road. To understand how someone arrives at the end of that road, you have to understand what the Bureau of Prisons is actually watching for inside its institutions, and the list is specific. Documented patterns from court records, Bureau of Prisons reports, and investigative journalism reveal that the triggers for ADX placement fall into distinct categories. The first is violence against staff or other inmates inside federal custody. The second is participation in or leadership of a prison gang or criminal organization operating from behind bars. The third is escape attempts or escape plots. The fourth is what officials describe as continued threat to institutional security, meaning an inmate who has been moved multiple times and continues to destabilize every facility they are placed in. And the fifth, perhaps the most chilling, is high-profile or high-risk status, meaning someone whose outside connections or public profile make ordinary housing a security risk to the entire institution. And each one of those categories represents a gate, and the path to ADX Florence is the path of walking through those gates, one at a time. Consider what happened in the case of Richard McNair. McNair was serving time in federal custody for murder when he engineered one of the most audacious prison escapes in American history, ultimately eluding recapture for years across multiple states and into Canada. His case is documented extensively in federal court records and reporting by outlets including NBC News. McNair's escape history did not just add years to his sentence. It fundamentally changed his classification. It demonstrated to the Bureau of Prisons that standard housing could not contain him. That categorization, that institutional determination, is precisely the kind of trigger that puts a person on the path toward Florence. Or consider the cases surrounding the Mexican Mafia, the prison gang that federal prosecutors have described in multiple RICO indictments as one of the most powerful criminal enterprises in the United States, operating actively from inside federal and state facilities. Court records from cases prosecuted in California and Texas show that leadership figures within that organization continued to issue orders, direct murders, and orchestrate criminal activity from their cells in high-security federal prisons. According to federal prosecutors in cases including United States v. Cavazos and related prosecutions, This ongoing criminal enterprise activity from within prison walls was itself a direct driver of ADX placements for specific members of that organization. The lesson from both of those documented cases is the same. The Bureau of Prisons is not just managing your crime, it is managing your behavior after your crime. And every action you take inside the system is data. It is being recorded. It is being assessed. And it can change your outcome. There is a phrase that former inmates and prison officials use in interviews and documented testimony alike: the prison inside the prison. ADX Florence is precisely that. It is what happens when the system decides that the standard prison is no longer sufficient. And the most disquieting part, according to reporting by journalist Sal Rodriguez and analysis published by Solitary Watch, the decision to place someone at ADX Florence can rest on administrative determinations that the inmate themselves may not be fully informed of in advance. The triggers are sometimes ambiguous. The process is reviewed but not always transparent, which means that for some men, the gate to ADX did not announce itself. They walked through it without fully understanding where it led. Let's talk about what ADX Florence actually is, because most people have a vague impression of it. The reality is more extreme than the impression. ADX Florence opened in 1994. It was built by the Federal Bureau of Prisons specifically to house what the Bureau described as the most dangerous, most escape-prone, and most disruptive inmates in the entire federal system. It sits in Fremont County, Colorado, at roughly 5,000 feet elevation, in a remote stretch of high desert and mountain terrain. That location is not accidental. It is part of the design, according to reporting from The Guardian and from academic analysis of supermax prison architecture published in journals including Criminology and Public Policy. ADX Florence was built around the concept of complete environmental control. The architecture itself is the punishment. Every element of the physical environment is designed to minimize human interaction and maximize supervision while reducing the possibility of escape or violence. An inmate in the general population at ADX Florence, before any step-down or program placement, lives in a cell that measures approximately 7 by 12 feet. That is smaller than most American bathrooms. The cell contains a concrete desk, a concrete stool, a concrete shelf, a toilet and sink combination unit, a shower within the cell itself so the inmate does not need to leave for hygiene, a 4-inch wide window that provides natural light but not a usable view of the outside world, a television mounted behind reinforced glass, and a door that is electronically controlled from a remote station, according to documentation reviewed by human rights organizations including Amnesty International. Inmates in the most restrictive status at ADX can go for extended periods with almost no direct human contact. Meals are delivered through a slot in the door. Medical checks happen through that same slot in many cases. Recreation is offered in a small individual cage, separate from other inmates, usually for approximately 1 hour per day. Former ADX warden Robert Hood gave an interview to CNN years after leaving the facility. In that interview, he described ADX as a clean version of hell. His words, that description matters, because it is not coming from a critic of the prison system. It is coming from the man who ran the place. Now consider what it means to be sent there not at the peak of a career as a notorious criminal, but in the aftermath of one incident, one violent confrontation, one decision that the Bureau of Prisons decided crossed a non-negotiable line. The case of Colin Ferguson is instructive. Ferguson, convicted of the 1993 Long Island Railroad mass shooting, was originally held at various high-security facilities before eventually being designated to ADX. According to court records and journalism covering his incarceration, his behavior inside federal custody, including alleged manipulation of staff and inmates, contributed to escalating security concerns. His classification intensified over time. The case of Thomas Silverstein is perhaps the most extreme documented example of what the ADX system can mean in practice. Silverstein, convicted of multiple murders of both inmates and a corrections officer while in federal custody, and more than 3 decades in conditions of extreme isolation. According to federal court records from Silverstein v. Federal Bureau of Prisons, he spent years in a specially designed cell at the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta before being transferred to ADX Florence where his isolation continued. The court records in that case provide the most Detailed documented account available of what long-term solitary confinement at the federal level actually looks like from the inside. Silverstein died in 2019, still in federal custody, after more than 3 decades of near-total isolation. His case is the outer limit, the end of the spectrum. But the spectrum itself is real, and it starts somewhere much more ordinary than where it ends. Here is where the story gets uncomfortably specific, because the phrase "one mistake" is not a metaphor, it is documented reality. Consider the documented pattern within federal institutions that researchers and former inmates describe in testimony and legal filings. The escalation cycle. It works like this. An inmate arrives at a medium or high security federal institution. They have a sentence. They have, theoretically, a release date. They begin serving their time. And then something happens. An altercation. A fight. An assault. It might be in self-defense. It might be in retaliation for something the prison system itself was slow to address. The reasons are complex and often disputed, but the outcome is not complex. That incident is documented. It is classified. And it changes the trajectory. According to the American Civil Liberties Union's reports on solitary confinement and the Bureau of Prisons, once an inmate is placed in restrictive housing following a violent incident, the restrictions themselves can generate further incidents. Isolation, according to multiple peer-reviewed studies including research published in JAMA Psychiatry, produces measurable psychological deterioration in the average person within weeks. That deterioration can manifest as aggression, mental health crises, or institutional infractions that lead to further restrictions. It is a cycle. And the cycle has an endpoint. That endpoint is ADX Florence. The case of Andrew Fastow is sometimes cited as an example of how white-collar federal inmates navigate the system. But the more relevant contrast comes from documented cases of street-level offenders, whose initial crimes were not in the most extreme categories but whose prison behavior triggered escalation. One of the most thoroughly documented cases in this respect is that of Zacarias Moussaoui, convicted of conspiracy in connection with the September 11th attacks. Moussaoui's placement at ADX Florence was not primarily driven by his crimes alone, though those crimes are among the most serious in American history. According to court records and Bureau of Prisons filings, his placement reflects a multi-factor security assessment. But his case illustrates a broader point. The Bureau of Prisons makes ADX determinations based on what it projects will happen, not only what has already happened. Risk, not just record. That projection-based logic is what makes the system so unforgiving for some inmates who are not household names. A 2014 investigation by the Denver Post into ADX Florence, which included interviews with former inmates and their attorneys, documented cases of men who arrived at ADX not because they were the leaders of criminal empires but because they had accumulated enough institutional infractions, enough violent incidents, enough escape concerns or gang affiliations, that the system had no other place to put them. One attorney quoted in that reporting described a client who had entered federal custody as a young man on a mid-level drug charge. Years of institutional violence, gang involvement that began inside prison, and multiple assault charges on corrections officers had, step by step, moved him through the classification system until he was sitting at the end of the line. His original crime was not ADX level. His prison behavior was. That is the mechanism. That is exactly how one mistake, or a series of mistakes, or one decision made in a violent moment inside a facility that was already dangerous, can determine the rest of your life. We are about to go inside the documented psychological and legal reality of what long-term ADX confinement actually does to a person. And we are going to look at the legal battles that have been fought over it. If you are still watching, drop a comment below with the word Florence so I know you are here. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the time. Now, we need to talk about what happens inside. Not because the details are punishment in themselves, but because this is the part of the story that reveals the true cost of the decisions that led here. The psychological evidence is substantial. According to a landmark report by Dr. Stuart Gracian, a Harvard Medical School psychiatrist who studied solitary confinement in American prisons and whose findings were submitted to federal courts in multiple cases, prolonged isolation produces a specific psychiatric syndrome. His work, cited in federal litigation including Rees v. Johnson. Documented symptoms including hypersensitivity to stimuli, perceptual distortions, paranoia, difficulty with thinking and concentration, and in severe cases, hallucinations. These are not the findings of a single researcher. They are corroborated by subsequent research published in peer-reviewed journals and by clinical assessments of inmates conducted as part of ongoing federal litigation. The United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners, known as the Mandela Rules, define solitary confinement exceeding 15 consecutive days as prolonged solitary confinement and classify it as cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. The United States has not formally adopted that standard in its federal prison operations. ADX Florence has housed inmates in isolation far exceeding that threshold, for years and in some cases decades. That legal and institutional context is not theoretical. It has been the subject of active federal litigation. In 2012, a group of current and former ADX inmates, represented by the nonprofit law organization the Civil Rights Education and Enforcement Center, filed a class action lawsuit against the Bureau of Prisons. That lawsuit, which proceeded through the federal courts under the case name Cunningham v. Federal Bureau of Prisons, alleged systematic failures to provide adequate mental health treatment to prisoners at ADX who suffered from serious mental illness, and raised constitutional claims under the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, according to coverage of that litigation by the Associated Press and the Denver Post. The case resulted in a settlement in 2015 in which the Bureau of Prisons agreed to implement mental health screening improvements and create a new treatment unit for mentally ill inmates, with the stated goal of moving some ADX inmates to less restrictive settings where treatment was available. The settlement did not close ADX Florence or fundamentally restructure its operations, but it was a federal acknowledgement that the conditions there have produced documented harm. Case names and the settlement terms are a matter of public federal court record for the inmates who are not mentally ill or who do not qualify for the treatment protocols. Life inside ADX Florence continues under the same basic conditions that have characterized the facility since 1994, and for many of them, the question is not just what the conditions feel like. It is whether there is any way out. The Bureau of Prisons does operate what it calls a step-down program at ADX Florence. According to Bureau of Prisons documentation, inmates who demonstrate sustained compliance and good behavior can theoretically move through a series of privilege levels that eventually allow for transfer to a less restrictive institution. The program exists on paper, but according to reporting by the Marshall Project and testimony from attorneys representing ADX inmates, the step-down process in practice has often moved slowly, been applied inconsistently, and in some cases has failed to result in actual transfer for years after eligibility was technically reached. Some men never leave, not because they never tried to comply, but because compliance alone is not always enough. Let's bring this back to the question we started with. How does one mistake lead here? The answer is not simple, but the pattern is clear. It starts with a crime that places a person inside the federal system. That crime does not have to be the worst crime imaginable. It has to be a federal crime that carries a significant sentence. Drug trafficking at scale, bank robbery, organized crime, conspiracy charges, federal assault. The sentence places the person in federal custody, and federal custody is a second environment. A second world with its own laws, its own hierarchies, its own violence, and its own consequences. Inside that second world, the Bureau of Prisons is watching. It is classifying. It is documenting every incident, every affiliation, every association, and every infraction. And the threshold for escalation is not always what an outside observer would expect. An assault on a corrections officer, even one that results in minimal physical injury, is among the most serious triggers in the classification system. According to Bureau of Prisons policy documents and court records, assaulting federal staff can immediately trigger placement in restrictive housing and can initiate the review process that ultimately leads to ADX designation. Gang affiliation is another critical trigger. According to federal gang intelligence reports cited in multiple RICO prosecutions, the Bureau of Prisons maintains ongoing intelligence files on prison gang membership, a documented affiliation with a recognized prison gang, particularly one that is identified as operating criminal enterprises from within federal facilities. can factor directly into ADX classification. This means that a person who joins a gang inside prison, perhaps for the survival logic that incarcerated people themselves have testified about in court hearings, can trigger the very classification outcome they were trying to protect themselves from: escape behavior. Even escape planning that is detected and disrupted is another irreversible trigger. According to Bureau of Prisons records cited in the case of Joseph Whitey Bulger's federal housing, threats to institutional security that include credible escape risk are treated at the highest level of the classification system. And then there is the category that is hardest to define and perhaps the most consequential for understanding how this system operates on people who are not household names. That category is the accumulation of incidents, not one dramatic act, a series of smaller events that, over time, build a file, a pattern, a classification. Court records reviewed in connection with ADX litigation show inmates whose path to Florence was not a single act of extreme violence but a documented history of institutional noncompliance, spanning years. Each incident small enough, perhaps, to seem manageable in isolation, collectively enough to seal a fate. This is the mechanism the title points to. Not that one mistake teleports a person directly to Florence, but that one mistake can be the first step in a chain. That chain, once started, is very hard to break. And for some people, the chain runs all the way to the end. Former ADX inmate Jack Powers, whose case was documented in federal court records and reported on by the Associated Press, suffered severe mental deterioration during his years at ADX Florence, according to court filings. His case became part of the Cunningham litigation. He entered federal custody on crimes that were serious but not in the class of mass casualty terrorism. He ended up at ADX, and according to the court record, the journey from one to the other was a documented escalation of incidents, classifications, and placements. His is not the only case like that. It is one of the few that has been extensively documented in public court records, which means it is the one we can tell. But it is not the only story. ADX Florence still houses approximately 400 men. Most of their names you will never know. Their files exist somewhere in federal databases. Their mistakes, large and small, are in there too. The mountain wind keeps blowing outside. The cells stay the same size. And the chain keeps running, one link at a time. For anyone who walks into it without understanding where it leads. If this video changed the way you think about what happens inside the American federal prison system, share it with one person who needs to see it. The algorithm rewards engagement, but the real reason to share this is that this story does not get told often enough. And the people inside it cannot tell it themselves. And if you want to understand how the most dangerous criminal networks inside those federal walls actually operate, and why some men will never leave regardless of any step-down program, the next video is already waiting for you. Asterisk, you have made it to the end. Most people do not. That tells me you take this seriously. Subscribe if you have not. Comment below with one thing from this video that you did not know before. And click the next video now, because the story inside ADX Florence does not end with the building. It ends with the networks that run through it. And that story is more disturbing than this one.